Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to see my board members and former Peace Corp volunteers and also our long-term supporters of the World Affairs Council Tacoma. My name is Miriam Anderson. I am the board member of the World Affairs Council Tacoma that is based in the city of Tacoma, Washington State. We are a small membership-based organization that promotes international diplomacy, international education, and global citizenship through various exciting and sometimes controversial educational programs. So these programs are open to public. They are all complimentary, and the membership dues go toward supporting the educational programs. So if you're interested to know a little bit more about us, our mission, would like to receive notification about upcoming events, please visit our website. I will very much appreciate. Now talk about the exciting program we have today, Peace Corp, Perspective and Reflections. Today we have two very exciting former volunteer of Peace Corp speaking today, Jerome Siangco and KENNEY TRAN. KENNEY was stationed in Colombia and Jerome was stationed in China. So they're going to share their experiences, stories, and share their perspectives about Peace Corps and its work around the globe. So each speaker is going to have about 10-12 minutes to speak. After that, we'll open the Zoom floor for questions and answers. You are welcome to post your question in the chat room. I will be able to monitor the chat. For any reason I miss anybody's question, I will ask Brian or Marsha to yell at me or wave that I missed the question so I can bring my attention to your question. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce you Jerome Siangco and KENNEY TRAN. So take on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Miriam. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I don't know if we have permission to do so. Jerome and I have prepared a PowerPoint, so I'll let you know.
You can tell me if you need a permission from me and I will do. Okay.
All right, awesome.
We see you.
Sounds great. All right, so hi everyone. My name is KENNEY TRAN, and along with Jerome, the two of us will be presenting on our perspectives and some reflections on Peace Corps as well as the work we did. So just to open up, my name is KENNEY TRAN. I served in Colombia from September 2018 to March of 2020, working in community economic development.
And hello, everyone. Good evening. As Miriam said, my name is Jerome Siangco. I served in China from June 2019 to February 2020, working in education. And just to echo what KENNEY said, thank you to the World Affairs Council of Tacoma for inviting us both to share in our reflections and perspectives, and then afterwards to engage in some dialogue. Our presentation today will be a mixture of introducing Peace Corps for those who might not be as familiar with the agency, as well as our own personal stories from our experience as volunteers in the field. So really looking forward to our discussion tonight.
So as Jerome just previously mentioned, the first thing we wanted to do was introduce the mission and then some of the goals of Peace Corps as a whole. There are three primary goals of Peace Corps. So the first one is to help the people of interested countries to meet their need for trained men and women, which is primarily the Peace Corps volunteer work. Second is to promote a better understanding of Americans on the part of the people served. So there is some level of intercultural exchange happening between American volunteers and then host country nationals as well. And then the third one is to promote a better understanding of other peoples on the part of Americans. So that includes going back to America after or during the course of one's service and talking about the experiences and interactions that one had with the host country nationals. For me, myself personally, I have nothing but great things to say about Colombia and Colombian people. I was just received with just nothing but warmth and love during my time. So I think a great thing about Peace Corps is that it definitely diminishes some of the stereotypes that exist across international boundaries.
And a big part of the goals of Peace Corps is what volunteers do as their primary objectives or goals in country. And with that first goal of meeting the need for trained Americans abroad, it's the idea that with Peace Corps, volunteers are invited to a host country, that host country is hosting volunteers, that the Peace Corps goes where they are needed. And by going where they are needed, the Peace Corps has 6 main categories of where volunteers serve. So that can be agriculture, working with local farmers or local crop builders to build new practices or to learn from one another. Community economic development, which Kenny will touch on more when he tells a little bit about his story as a volunteer. Education is what I focused on. So in China, I focused on teaching English at the tertiary level, at the university level to English majors. The environment, working on protecting our planet, sometimes working with NGOs or other local organizations to help better the environment. Health, health takes a lot of examples, including HIV and AIDS prevention or education, really focusing on building healthy global communities, and then also youth in development, working with the next generation of leaders, working with community groups. And there's a small note here, about 2% of volunteers are in Peace Corps Response. Peace Corps Response is a specialized group of volunteers. The saying, as I've heard, is short-term, high impact, where a lot of our Peace Corps Response volunteers serve in the field for about 6 to 12 months, usually in specialized roles, whereas Peace Corps volunteers who are not response serve in the field for anywhere between 2 to 3 years.
And with that in mind, thank you, Jerome. So Peace Corps volunteers serve in a variety of places. Unfortunately, this is a relatively outdated map due to the coronavirus. All upwards of 140 country programs were temporarily closed, but Peace Corps is currently in the process of reassigning volunteers into the field, starting with a small batch of volunteers who are going to places such as Colombia. And I know that recently there have also been Peace Corps expansions as well, such as the expansion into Peace Corps Vietnam, which was a treaty signed sometime during the Obama administration and soon to be followed up when Peace Corps completely reopens in the following years. So as we can see, a majority of Peace Corps volunteers serve in Africa, with followed by Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, and then the smallest percentage of volunteers work in the Caribbean and North Africa and the Middle East. I'll be touching upon my experiences working in community economic development in Latin America, in particular the Colombian coast. So where I lived was a small town called Salamina Magdalena. It is relatively an island of sorts, where it is a small town of 7,000 people in the quote unquote urban sector of the town. And it's really a farming and fishing based town. It's on the other side of the river of Atlantico, which is where the great city of Barranquilla lies. And to get there most effectively, you would need to take a boat. So that's just a little bit of background towards where I lived in comparison to a lot of different volunteers that may have lived in a more urban site or an easier to reach area. I think one of the greatest things about Peace Corps and learning about other individual sites is the wide variety of transportation modes and just understanding the way that host country nationals live based on their geographic area and location. So within this small town, I worked in community economic development, which had 4 quote unquote primary objectives. My first objective was to create community savings groups. That is primarily working with farmers and agriculture members in order to save up money, have their collective save up money in order to buy out accessories that would help them during the course of their jobs instead of renting it out. Kind of teaching them about the long-term impact of purchasing their own refrigerator and the economic savings that would bring them in comparison to the short-term instability of renting out a refrigerator every week for, let's say, for example, $25, when saving up $100 would allow them to buy a refrigerator for long-term usage and help them grow their own business. The second objective is the one that I think Peace Corps is most commonly known for, which is working within the schools. For me, primarily, I worked on a team called Construye tus Sueños, which translates to Build Your Dreams, which was the development and utilization of an entrepreneurship curriculum. We partnered with the Ministry of Education, and towards the end of our time, we got the curriculum nationalized for Colombian citizens in order to teach them entrepreneurship skills that would help them in the orange economy that Colombia was attempting to promote, which is an intersection of entrepreneurship and cultural skills to help young students really maximize their potential, while also having Colombian students share out the rich culture and history that exists in the country. The third thing that I worked on as a community economic development volunteer is working with SENA, or the National Training Service. So SENA was basically a traveling trade school of sorts that would go town to town after receiving around 25 to 30 applications, and they would teach local host country nationals how to do things such as artisanship, leather working, how to raise cattle, pigs, as well as ranging anywhere to sausage making. So it really depended on the cultural context and depended on the state that you lived in. So for me, living in Magdalena, we had a lot of area for cow and pig growth. So a lot of the classes that were taught to my particular town were based more on farming, while other states were really had heavy emphasis on the creation of sausages and leather working. And then our fourth primary objective was working with small businesses. So I find myself in the very, very lucky position of working with a lot of small restaurants in my town and getting to kind of taste test their products and talking about marketing strategy. So overall, not a terrible job at all. And then some secondary projects that we also worked on outside of the realm of community economic development can range anywhere from sports to gender equity. So for me, one of the things that I really focused on with a lot of my cohort members was the increase of gender equity in sports. So we decided to hold American football and basketball camps and travel around the coast of Colombia, talking to youth about gender equity through sports. And that's really something that I was passionate about throughout my time. All right, and I'm going to hand it over to Jerome for his experience in China.
Going a little northeast from Kenny, I was in China in a city called Liupanshui in Guizhou province. So this is southwest China, pretty far from Beijing and Shanghai on the east. For all of the Peace Corps volunteers that were in China, when I was there, there was about 140 of us Americans serving as Peace Corps volunteers. We all were on Western provinces or municipalities in Western China. For those who know China, we were in Gansu, Sichuan, Guizhou, and then Chongqing. So all Western China, pretty developing, still up and coming compared to what people think of China as regards to Beijing or Shanghai. And so where I was in Liupanshui, this used to be a really, a couple of decades ago, a coal mining town where the sky would be black because of all of the coal mining. But in recent years, it's really turned itself around. As you can see there, it's nicknamed the cool city of China because of the year-round cool temperatures, and it also has one of the best air quality in China. The name Liupanshui is a combination of 3 district names within the city, Liuzhi, Panzhou, and Shuicheng. Where I lived closest to Shuicheng, and compared to other cities in China, Liupanshui is pretty small, which it's weird saying that for a city of 3 million, but in the urban and the city, it's about 300,000 people. And in the pictures, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the next slide, but just briefly in the pictures, in the top left corner, that picture of that lake with a dragon's head coming out and that bridge, that was on the university campus where I taught. So part of my university was this entire wetland park that I would be able to walk at during my breaks or after school or after teaching. The top right-hand corner picture, that is an aerial view, or what we can say is an aerial view of the walk down to my campus in the mornings from the mountain where we lived on top of, and we would walk down to the campus. Bottom left picture, again, a lot of mountains. So Liupanshui is really hidden amongst the mountains where there's different types of trains in China where you can take either just a normal train at normal speed, or you can take faster trains, really going through just on a normal train, no fast trains, being able to see the mountains, and then the city appears. The middle picture and the bottom, that was a picture from my campus looking out into the city. And then the bottom right-hand picture is a picture of what would translate to as the old town in the city, more architecture and more of that culture and history. Kenny, next slide, please. Thank you. And So as I briefly said earlier, my main focus in China was education. And so all of the Peace Corps volunteers that were in China taught at different universities or colleges, working predominantly with what are called normal universities. And in the Chinese context, normal indicates a teaching university where the students who we taught will go on to become teachers themselves. And so at my university where I taught, it was Liu Panshui Normal University. I solely taught English majors. So for my first year students, I taught spoken English, which was a lot of fun getting them out of their comfort zones. For some of my students, I was the first, yes, the first American, but also let alone the first foreigner that they were able to interact and engage with. And then for my sophomores and juniors who might have had a Peace Corps volunteer teacher before me, I taught them news listening, which was really interesting and a lot of fun. I used Voice of America a ton to find just random news stories from around the world, from teaching about snakeskin watches in Nairobi, to teaching about the upcoming Olympics that was then, just doing a lot of random news to get them exposed to news from around the world. And so really my primary role was at the university teaching English courses. But then where I also enjoyed a lot of my time in the education sector was in regards to secondary activities, which was very much focused on how to build upon lessons that were taught in the classroom to then create less stressful settings, so to say, to help engage English learning, and then also hit on some of those goals of the Peace Corps that Kenny introduced earlier, particularly with introducing American culture and American understanding on the part of host country nationals, and then also bringing that back home here to the US. And so some of the activities that myself and my other Peace Corps volunteer at site put together was English Corner. So those were fun games or activities on Friday afternoons for students to engage one another and practice English in a more fun setting. Cooking Club was something I did every 2 weeks. The bottom two pictures there, one I prepared, one my students prepared. I will say though, to be honest, the one that does look a little bit more tastier to the far right, those were my students. A group of students and I went grocery shopping one morning, and they spent the afternoon cooking in my apartment. And they all made me different dishes from their hometowns, which was really nice for me to experience as a cultural exchange. The middle picture, which is a little hard to see, but you're not missing much, trust me. That was from Thanksgiving, where I took it upon myself to make dishes for some of my students that reminded me of home for Thanksgiving. And so I tried my best doing on a stovetop, making a meatloaf, deviled eggs, and then also being Filipino American, I made some Filipino dishes as well, including pancit, which is a noodle dish. And then I also tried making egg rolls as well. Beyond that, though, a lot of the other things that I did was focused on the needs of the school, included English speech competitions, teaching English to faculty and staff outside of the English department. So for example, bringing in engineers and chemistry professors and helping them learn English in a fun way as well after hours. And then being a mentor to the English Fans Association, which I did a lot of English judging for competitions and just working with students in that group. And that was the bottom left picture.
All right, so with all that in mind, if people have additional questions about the Peace Corps after this presentation and our Q&A sessions as well, Peace Corps has a variety of social media that is being utilized throughout the current day. So for more information on Peace Corps as a whole, peacecorps.gov is a great area to kind of get started and get some additional questions, whether or not you're deciding to apply or do some research for it to answer any questions that students or other people in your life might have. So again, the Peace Corps is available on Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, as well as YouTube as well. So there's a variety of different Peace Corps experiences, and I highly also recommend check out YouTube, as there are a lot of volunteers who kind of do their own vlogs throughout their Peace Corps experience as well. All right, and with that in mind, we're just going to open the floor for questions, and we really thank you all for your time. We're looking forward to all the questions that you all have and to share more of our perspective.
Yes, thank you. And Miriam, I'm not sure how you want to do this, but I'm ready to jump right in. I see Brian's question in the chat, or
Yeah,
how you
I
wanted
would
to.
say go ahead and share your screen. And my question, I will start with the first question, and then Brian, you can ask the question directly by yourself. My question will be, out of all international organizations where you can volunteer your time, whether local or internationally, what made you to choose Peace Corps particularly?
I
Why
know
Peace Corps,
for
not World Vision, and not somebody else, not something else?
I know for me, after throughout college, I knew I wanted to do some form of service, whether it was domestic or international. I had not studied abroad during my undergraduate years, and so that's one reason that drew me to that international focus of looking at international service programs. My undergraduate degree was in Asian studies, and so I knew I wanted to focus on Asia. So I was looking at programs that were service oriented, had a space for me to go to Asia, but then also I knew I wanted to work for the US government or work in some form of service to the American people and to the government in some capacity, either now or later on in my career. And I thought Peace Corps would be a good entryway. And it just worked out that I graduated end of May, and Peace Corps China was leaving 3 weeks later. And when I applied, it was either Mongolia or Peace Corps for me, or Mongolia or China, excuse me, to choose from for sites in Asia. And Mongolia was leaving a week after graduation. I knew I wanted a little bit more time with family after graduating from college, and so really Peace Corps China just fit right in, and it hit all the marks for what I wanted for service.
Fantastic. What about you, Kenny?
Yeah, I think on a similar note, one of the things I kind of focused on during the course of my undergraduate degree was the intersection of social good between the nonprofit sector and then governments. So Peace Corps to me was this weird entity that does a little bit of groundwork, working with a lot of ground level nonprofits while also being an entity of the US government. So I found that intersection to be really interesting, especially working in international development and also trying to promote sustainable practices. Unlike Jerome, however, I did have the very fortunate opportunity to study abroad, which actually furthered my interest in Peace Corps. So after doing a little bit of study abroad in both Nicaragua and Ireland, just learning a little bit more about intercultural exchanges and having a lot of these intercultural experiences, I kind of understood that after graduation, it would be one of the things I wanted to do. And I was very fortunate as well throughout the course of my internships to have a lot of former Peace Corps volunteers talk to me about their experiences, you know, both the pros and the cons. But for me, I felt like it was a very good pathway to both understanding and focusing and narrowing on the area in which I wanted to go to. I think after working with educational policy experts on the ground level in Colombia, I really wanted to focus on that public policy position, which leads to where I am now. I think that Peace Corps is a really good opportunity for people to kind of like narrow in on what they want to learn, what they want to do, while also getting a very macro view of how international development works. So similar to Jerome, I was offered a variety of different options, and I definitely felt like, you know, staying a little bit longer at home and saying my goodbyes after graduation would be really helpful, which is why I ended up choosing Colombia over the Ghana or the Gambia.
Okay, I will ask Brian Dirks. You can go ahead and ask your question directly to Jerome.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I happened to be in the Sichuan province in 2006. And when I was there, I definitely felt like, especially in one of the cities we went to, like I was being kind of watched or monitored, and some things were happening that led me to believe that. And I was wondering if you kind of experienced that when you were there, if you were limited in terms of what topics you could say, or if you felt totally open, and I guess if you had any fear associated with that, if that was the case. I just don't know if things have changed since I was there.
I definitely, short answer is yes.
Okay.
I know for all of us landing and being used to just the amount of cameras or surveillance, I'm guessing it's only grown since Brian, since you've been there. But it was a new experience, especially coming from the US, where in the US we value our privacy, but in China it was hard, particularly in your daily life, to not notice a camera either on the street or what was unique about, just in general, also when you're teaching in the classroom, there are cameras in all of the classrooms just watching. And so definitely being monitored or just having that idea in the back of your head was something to get used to. In regards to areas that I could teach or say, I thought the Peace Corps did a really good job of training us on cultural sensitivities or being aware of current events or how to handle those situations, particularly when I was there, 2019 going into 2020, US-China tensions were escalating. A lot of rhetoric, particularly out of the US government, was more harsher, more stricter on China. And I didn't have it as bad as some of my colleagues did in the Peace Corps and other schools where their colleagues who were host country nationals or other teachers would be more on them about asking them. I got pretty good at dodging questions, to be honest, or changing the topics. In regards to teaching, I was very aware, particularly around world news, of which world news to teach. So that's why the examples I mentioned, snakeskin watches in Nairobi, or looking at sports, for example, it was being aware of what was happening in the world and being able to teach around that and still meet my lesson goals and meet my objectives.
Okay, thank you very much. Great answer.
I think, Marcia, your question was answered partially as well by Jerome. Another question will be how, I would just combine, there's two more questions that I can combine together. How do you become the volunteer for Peace Corps, number one? What kind of preparation do you go through in order to be assigned to a specific country? And by doing so, do you have to speak the local language?
Yeah, I can definitely tackle this as I actually applied to become a Peace Corps campus ambassador at one point in my life. So to become a Peace Corps volunteer, there are some de facto age restrictions as well as educational attainment requirements. So with that, in the past, it used to be like basically anyone over the age of 18 with a high school degree could become a Peace Corps volunteer. But in the new age of Peace Corps, where a lot of these tangible soft skills need to be learned beforehand, I think that having a college degree, I believe in some cases, it's associates, but most of the time a bachelor's degree is required for a lot of these positions. I know for community economic development, the desired requirements were a master's degree. So I think times have definitely changed in that perspective. To become a Peace Corps volunteer, you go throughout an application process, as Hillary Holman has just placed in the chat. You find your specific country that you want to apply to, but at the end of the day, during the course of your application, they do ask if you are open to different possibilities and availabilities that are open. While it does help to be fluent in the language, some people just aren't, and some people go in with basically zero knowledge. I know it is definitely beneficial to be honest on your application, as they'll place you somewhere that you're going to be a little bit more easily adapted to. I know for me, I took high school Spanish and I may or may not have lied on my resume about being good at it. So going into training, I think they did a really good job of getting volunteers up to speed. And then again, I don't think there's really any replacement for lived experiences. So within, I'd say probably 10 weeks of living in my training site, I was able to speak Spanish to a fluent level and start working. So I think that the language requirement isn't necessarily a deal breaker, but be prepared to learn at a very quick rate, especially for some of these countries that may not have a lot of language opportunities here in the US.
And to add on to Kenny's points, some countries, some sites will require, I know when I was looking at places that I could serve, particularly those in Latin America and the Caribbean, have a Spanish requirement, for example. But I know most places, China included, accepted volunteers with different language abilities. And really, when you go as a Peace Corps volunteer, you spend the first 10 weeks in country training. And that's where you learn about the Peace Corps, learn about the job that you're doing. But then also there's that language and culture training where when I went to China, we were a group of 70 volunteers in my cohort, and we got broken down into 4 separate groups based on previous teaching and language experience. And I know for 2 of those groups, there were no Chinese language ability background whatsoever. And so they were able to, as Kenny said, really pick it up really quickly. And by those 10 weeks, you had to test we did language tests. You have to test at least at a novice high to be able to communicate in your daily lives. I know for me, I've found those language classes really beneficial for my own Chinese background, where I went in with an intermediate high level and I was able to come out at an advanced low after my time in China, which I really appreciated having those language abilities thereafter.
Thank you for sharing. A quick question. And after my question, I will ask John Lucas to ask the question to both of you. My question is, was there any kind of chance or instances where the volunteer went for 10 weeks, went through the training and said, no, I don't want to be here in this particular designated location? Can that person request to be transferred somewhere else in a different location, or he or she needs to completely disassociate himself or herself from Peace Corps?
Yeah, so after your first initial 10 weeks of Peace Corps training, there's a very big event in a lot of countries. I don't know if it was the same for us, Jerome, but we had this thing called site reveal, which was basically at around the week 8, week 9 mark, after you figured out, their staff has figured out whether or not you have reached the minimum language requirements. Everyone gets placed into their specific site. You do a few days of training within your site just to kind of get the general vibe of how things are going. There is a lot of opportunities for check-in with Peace Corps staff and supervisors to see whether or not you and the site are an appropriate fit. I know that even throughout the course of Peace Corps, there were a couple of volunteers who ended up changing sites, either, like a month in, a couple years in. So just because you are assigned to a particular site doesn't mean that you have to particularly stay there. But unfortunately, there were also volunteers that did not meet the criteria at the end of training and had to go home in that way as well. I think one of the things that is important to remember is that it is a volunteer obligation, not a requirement. So at any time, volunteers could go home for any personal reasons, or if they decided that Peace Corps just wasn't for them.
I remember site reveal well, because not just because it just happened, but it was very much like the Super Bowl, where there was 70 of us in a room and they would go province by province, and we would reveal really where we were hopefully going to spend the next 2 years living and working. And it was a really exciting time. But the Peace Corps does do a really good job, at least from my experience, really training volunteers over these 10 weeks, but then also making that decision if a volunteer is not ready to go to site, or they are not progressing in the training, they will be reevaluated and potentially, as Kenny mentioned, be asked to go back to the United States.
Okay, John, you're welcome to ask your question.
Oh, yeah. So I was, coming back from the Peace Corps, probably, after spending a couple of years in a very different countries, probably a bit of culture shock going back. And I was wondering, when you came back to the US, were there aspects of life in the US that you saw in a different light after having been away for so long?
Yeah, that is definitely a fantastic question. And I think for me, unfortunately, I came back at the very beginning of the pandemic. So the culture shock was double, I think, because there was not only the Colombian coast to American culture shock, but also the American pandemic culture shock on top of it. I think one of the biggest adjustments that I had to face was the lack of feeling of community. I think was like the biggest thing for me. Like one of the best parts of day-to-day Colombian life was knowing that if I was just to walk to school every day, that walk would take me an hour and a half, not because it was a far walk, it was really like 10 blocks, but that everyone would stop, say hi to you, they invite you to sit down in a chair, invite you in for soup, and you just have these very extended conversations and this feeling of you were a part of something greater than yourself. So that was one of the things I really found beneficial and different than my day-to-day life in the United States, especially living in large-scale apartment complexes or potentially even on a college campus where you might spend, a year, 2 years, 3 years not knowing your neighbors. But, in a place like coastal Colombia, where, I think there was a really good saying from some staff members, the weather might be warm, but the people are even warmer. I think that was one of the things that really, really was a huge part of my experience. And so kind of settling it back into the United States context, especially here in Seattle, which is kind of known with the Seattle freeze. I don't think it's real, but I think that's definitely one of the aspects of community that I really do miss, and I had to adjust to that. in addition to like the work-life balance as well.
I think my response in regards to culture shock, coming back from China, there were little things I think that I had built as habits that were a little strange for me to do in the US. For example, banquet etiquette or culture in China was very much more giving food to other people, toasting, little things like that that aren't as common in the US. I think took me some time to get used to, or technology. But I do think my time in China did bolster how I engage with people here in the United States by just being able to observe, and being a foreigner in another country, being able to observe and learn and anticipate what's happening around you really helped bolster my relationships here in the US by really anticipating. I talk a lot about relationships because in the Chinese context, there's a term called guanxi, or relationships, and it's really about how you know other people and engage and do things for other people and they do things for you. And really that's helped my relationships here in the United States and how I engage, particularly with business, and forming those relationships.
Thank you, both of you. I think Frank Frank, I'm sorry, I did not see your picture. You were raising the hand, so go ahead and ask the question. And after that, I will ask Beth to ask the question.
Okay, it's trivial, but culture shock for me coming back when I was in the Peace Corps in the 60s in Paraguay. But when I came back, there was a thing called Kraft American cheese, individual slices wrapped in plastic. And that was such a shock. I mean, it's incredible. I remember it now as such a shock. You know, why would anybody do that? Individually wrapped in plastic slices of Kraft American cheese. In Paraguay, plastic at that time was so rare that a plastic glass, a plastic cup, a plastic plate, or a fork or spork, there were no sporks, but a fork or a knife, they were so rare that they were very valuable. People would fight to buy them. But you know, the shock when I came back to the United States, the cultural shock, you know, this personified it for me. The Kraft individually wrapped slices of American cheese, which, you know, who wants to eat that stuff anyway?
I can feel it. That was because I'm from Republic of Georgia myself. So when I came in 1999 and I went to do the grocery shopping, I was completely lost. The choices, selections really shocked me. I'm like, wow, there should be one type of butter, one type of milk. Yeah, interesting. So go ahead, Beth, go ahead and ask your question.
Great. So my question is, would you mind sharing how it was to be evacuated? How did you feel? And how about your host country nationals, knowing that you were there one day and going to be gone the next?
I can start, I guess, with my so-called evacuation story. It was a very strange moment, I think, Beth, to answer that second part of your question, because when China was one of the first countries, if not the first country, to pull their volunteers, and it was right after Spring Festival. And so for most of our cities and our schools, they were on winter holiday. All of the teachers, our colleagues and faculty had gone to their hometowns. Our cities were pretty empty. And so it was really after the fact, after we had already been sent back to the United States, that it was then catching up with colleagues, with students who were then going back to school, and we were just not there. With China in particular, we thought we were going to Bangkok, Thailand for 2 weeks of training, where Peace Corps has regional hubs. And so for the Asia region, the Peace Corps regional hub is in Bangkok. And really it was one mindset thinking we were going there for training, next mindset we were closing out our service. And it was a whole ordeal of emotions, not knowing what to expect. At the end of the day, yes, it was the right call for everyone, but it was just a very much emotional turmoil. And then going back to the United States, it was a whole reselling process. But thankful that Peace Corps, I think, made the right call pulling out volunteers. Little did we know 2 years later we would still be in a global pandemic, but right call nonetheless.
Yeah, I think for me, like Colombia wasn't part of the early evacuation stage, but rather the large scale global evacuation. We had received some kind of notification based on like the variety and amount of group chats that like global RPCVs, Peace Corps volunteers were in. But we started seeing things such as travel restrictions, especially to and from Colombia, which was kind of a sign of things to come. For us, very similarly in Colombia, Carnival was the very big celebration just a week before the evacuation. So people were riding high, just about to get back into the swing of things. And for me personally, I was around 4 months from closing out my service. So I was already on that path of, like talking to my teachers, my coworkers, and all these wonderful people I had built relationships with. And a lot of us were actually in the city at the time in order to get final trainings and stuff like that. So once we received that email, it just felt like a very big shock. We received that email, I recall very distinctly, at around 9 p.m. And so for a lot of us, we had to travel back to our home, to our sites, like say our final goodbyes within a time frame of, I'd say, like 3 to 5 hours, and then find a way back to the capital city in order to get evacuated. So I think it was definitely the right call, but it was definitely a very difficult thing of like, you have previously just spent the last 2 years living and just being a part of this wonderful community. And it was really hard to kind of just like tell people that hopefully I will be back, right? Because a lot of volunteers, especially in my cohort, didn't feel like we got the opportunity to close out the service the way we wanted to, of having to say those immediate goodbyes and leave a lot of threads unanswered, especially for, a lot of us who were really dedicated to our jobs and co-facilitators of this like wonderful curriculum we had built over the years together. It felt like we were unfinished. So that's definitely something that lingers on the back of our minds a lot. And I know like keeping in touch with my cohort as well as like a lot of my Colombian friends and co-workers, it does feel like while things have definitely progressed, it doesn't feel like there was any sort of closure to that. So I think, again, hopefully there comes a day where a lot of us can return back to our sites and kind of give it the proper send off.
That's nice. Thank you.
Marcia, I think you sent me a couple of questions. You can ask like about the impact. You sent me like 2 questions. Do you want to ask or do you want me to ask them? Okay, you need to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
I'm muting because of my very loud cat. You don't want to hear him. But
you're
I believe
welcome to ask a question you sent to me, or I can ask you.
Yeah, I think the ones I sent earlier were answered. So if you see another one in there from me, go ahead, Miriam.
Okay, so my other question for you will be, when you came back and you had this wonderful experience, did your experience had any effect on you making a choices, what kind of career you want to build, or made any impact when you were drafting the resume and somebody was reading your resume saying, wow, you were in a Peace Corps? What kind of, I want to ask, like, what's the benefit of being a volunteer of Peace Corps down the road in long term?
I know from my experience, I knew at the end of my 2 to 3 years in Peace Corps, I was going to go back to graduate school and get a master's focused on either international policy or international development. And with the mass evacuation, it really just sped up that timeline of when I wanted to do things in my life. And so one of the benefits of being a Peace Corps volunteer is a lot of universities have what is called the Coverdale Fellowship, which is a scholarship for returned Peace Corps volunteers that selected Peace Corps volunteers when they apply to a university and they indicate that they are a Peace Corps volunteer, that they can be eligible for this fellowship. And thankfully, the school I went to for graduate school, the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, they gave that fellowship out to everyone who was a Peace Corps, returned Peace Corps volunteer of my incoming year. A lot of graduate schools, thankfully, in response to the mass evacuations, not only of the Peace Corps, but I think this was also true in some cases for also Fulbright, another government program that was cut short because of the pandemic. A lot of graduate schools actually reopened their applications. For graduate school, most applications close earlier in the year, maybe January or even December of the year prior. But a lot of graduate schools reopened their application cycles for volunteers who were evacuated. And thankfully, I was able to apply to some and then also eventually start graduate school that coming fall, months after being evacuated, and thankful for that opportunity. Also, a lot of services, particularly offered through the National Peace Corps Association, which works, their mission, it's a nonprofit, is for working with returned Peace Corps volunteers, and they offered a lot of resources, mentorships, and then also the local Seattle area Peace Corps Association as well offered resources for returned Peace Corps volunteers or evacuated volunteers.
Yeah, going off that as well, I think there are a lot of benefits that are just outside of that wonderful link that Hillary sent. I think on top of what Jerome had mentioned with the Coverdale Fellowship, I know that a lot of, like he said, a lot of schools actually did outreach to a lot of Peace Corps volunteers who were evacuated because, again, there are a lot of soft and transferable skills throughout one's time that I think that transcends a resume. You know, there's a lot of on-the-fly adaptive things that happen. Let's say, for example, you were to go to your classroom and the power goes out. You know, like class continues that day. And I think that adaptability is just one of those fantastic things that people learn on the fly. Project management, intercultural competency, these might just be words on a resume, but like when faced with these challenges in the real workplace, I think having Peace Corps volunteers in any of these areas would be a fantastic add to organizations. But like Jerome had mentioned, on top of Coverdale, there was also non-competitive eligibility, which basically was a fast pass for a lot of government job applications for returned Peace Corps volunteers, and that eligibility was extended for 2 years after either the return or after a graduate degree. So I think there are a lot of great benefits. And like Jerome previously mentioned as well, the networking is fantastic. I think that, you know, a lot of people with these shared lived experiences throughout the Peace Corps are more than happy to, you know, pass a recommendation along to someone that they know has these very soft transferable skills. So especially in the Seattle area, a lot of nonprofits, a lot of NGOs will have a returned Peace Corps volunteer on their staff. So just making that instant connection is definitely a benefit. So I think, again, it goes far beyond just like the networking and the physical tangible objects. I think in total, it just really allows an individual to really develop their soft skills in a way that makes them just a more well-rounded person, I think.
Fantastic. Question also, when you are Peace Corps volunteer, can you travel throughout that particular region for your personal curiosity or part of your assignment? Can you do that?
Yes, Kenny, you can correct me if I'm wrong. As a volunteer, you earn, was it 2 days per month that you're in service?
You got 2 vacation days and then 2 out of sight days per month. So realistically, every month that you worked, you got 4 days. So the way I understood it as a person who was like trying to fast track my way to like the Peace Corps volunteer leader position and like explain these rules to future Peace Corps volunteers was that every single month you had 2 out of sight days, which basically meant you could utilize these days to either visit friends, go to the city to like hit up the supermarket, ATMs, things of that nature. So those were use it or lose it days throughout the course of every single month. And on the other side of things, you also gain vacation days. So those days you could stack up and say for example, a holiday trip home, or if you wanted to go visit a friend in a different country or a different part of the country that wasn't a friend's site. So you had a variety of different ways to kind of save up your time to travel. I know personally in Colombia, a majority of the country was available to us, but there are certain particular zones that Peace Corps will not allow you to travel to during your time. So those are kind of designated red zones. But I think in general, the travel opportunities are definitely plentiful. However, it does come at the obvious trade-off of not spending a lot of time with your community. So, like there are a lot of traveling workshops, especially for teachers, where you could do traveling workshops like I had previously mentioned. I got the great opportunity to travel district to district and talk about curriculum advocacy and also teach American football and gender equity. So there are a lot of opportunities, but it does come out the trade-off of not spending a little bit more time in your community. I think that it's definitely one of the great benefits of Peace Corps and learning about these very hidden, beautiful spots that don't really appear on any travel guide.
That's the reason to be, that's the advantage of being a Peace Corps volunteer, that you can visit the places that usually are not promoted in the marketing materials. The question I want to ask, and actually, Beth, thank you for bringing up this question about the age. I was planning to ask what's the kind of age range for person to be a volunteer, because in our group right now, we have different age people attending today's program. So what's the minimum age the person should be in order to become a volunteer, and if there is the age limit as we get older, like me, we're 50, 60, some of 70, so wow. So can you address, kind of give me information about that?
As Kenny mentioned earlier, the minimum age is 18, and really with that that idea of a max or of an age limit, as long as you're physically able to meet whatever the demands of the host country or whatever the Peace Corps says in regards to going through physicals and a medical check, as long as you can hit those marks, there is no really age limit for being a volunteer, as long as you can just meet the requirements for your host site. Minimum 18, really, but then afterwards, as long as you're at least 18 years old, anyone can do it, as long as they hit the requirements. And as Marcia said in the chat, Lillian Carter traveled to India as a Peace Corps volunteer when she was 80. And so really, it's sky's the limit. Just be older than 18.
Yeah, and we have Beth. Hello, are you there? Let me scroll you down. Yay, our wonderful Beth, our wonderful former board member. She was a Peace Corps volunteer in Africa for 3 years. I remember she did a wonderful presentation at the Bellarmine High School. Can you say a few words about your experience as women 50 and above in Africa, briefly?
Sure, and these guys have done such a great job, so I don't let them still speak, but I just as you mentioned, if people are in the audience are interested, I joined a Peace Corps when I was 54. I was the only older volunteer in my stage, in my group, and one of the younger volunteers, when he knew me a little later on, said, "Oh, I thought you were the mother of one of the volunteers who just couldn't let her child go when we went through training." So, but it was a great experience. I think, as they said, your health is the big issue, and I did have to come back for a medical evacuation is a little strong, but I had to come back for a medical reason. And there was a woman in DC who was also there, and she was in her 70s. So yeah, it's mainly based on your health. And in my case, I came back, I was in DC for 6 weeks getting the issue resolved. And then I did go back and finish my service. And it was a great experience.
Fantastic. There's a question from Mike asking about whether you ever been concerned about your safety, whether you're in China or Colombia.
I think that while I think inherently in any particular country, even here in the United States, there are always safety issues about working and just living in a lot of areas, Peace Corps staff does a great job talking about security measures that one can take. For example, like again, as I previously mentioned, there are red zones in every single country that may have a particularly high rate of crime towards foreigners and things like that. So they give you a little bit of background information on how to mitigate these situations. But I think within a majority of communities where you're in, I think once you become entrenched in, in particularly a small town like I was in, like there will be nothing bad that happens to you because everybody already knows who you are, right? Like I think that bad news travels fast in a lot of these small towns. And one of the funniest examples I could think of was like a Peace Corps volunteer lived in a house and they left their gate open and like a student ran in and like took their water bottle or something. So within like an hour and a half, the whole town was like, hey, this water bottle was taken. And, like the grandmother of the child, like brings the child over, makes them apologize, and it becomes like a little town story, right? So I think in a lot of these small communities, once you become a part of something greater than yourself, you really do end up just living out these experiences and being a part of it rather than like kind of an outsider where things could happen to you. So that's kind of my perspective on it. I don't know, Jerome, if you had anything additional about safety.
I will say 2 points, one from my perspective, and then one just an overview. But from my perspective, where I lived, I did feel relatively safe, not only because of the Peace Corps training, but because of who the Peace Corps assigned as maybe as our co-teacher, who's a host country national, the school staff that has worked with Peace Corps volunteers in the past, that they were excellent resources, that they answered my questions, looked after me. If I went to a banquet or if I went to a school event, I knew who my allies were and who to trust to be able to look out for me and answer my questions in regards to safety and security. But the second point I want to make is that both Kenny and I are talking from our own perspectives, our own experiences. No agency, no organization is going to be perfect. And there are a bunch of, not a bunch, but a handful of stories that are public and much more that are not public of safety and security concerns, particularly with the Peace Corps. And it's good that these stories are coming to light in regards that the Peace Corps can address these safety and security concerns. Those stories are on the news. I think USA News Today did a good report of a security story a couple months ago of there are instances where the Peace Corps can be better and it should be better. And I think as volunteers go back into the field, there is much room for improvement.
Thank you, both of you. There is one more question from Benny Kata. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. You would like to ask the question by yourself, or do you want me to address your question? Benny? Okay, so the question, I will just read her question. Okay, Benny, yeah, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I'm presently from India. I do carry some experience, around some 20 years in livelihood and agriculture. So can I serve somewhere in India, Asia, or African countries? Is it possible?
Unfortunately, one of the requirements of Peace Corps is to be an American citizen. So if one has American citizenship, then they can apply to be a part of the Peace Corps. But unfortunately, at this time, it is still a intercultural exchange on the part of American citizens to external countries.
Oh, thank you, Kenny. Yeah.
Okay. Frank, Marsha told me that you have your hand up again. I'm sorry, I did not see you. So go ahead. If you have any question, you're welcome to ask.
I'm sorry, I don't want to monopolize here, but the question of safety. When I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the 60s, and anybody who was, a Peace Corps volunteer back then, can probably verify this, but I was threatened. My wife and I were threatened by the political boss, the dictator's best friend in Paraguay. And it was not taken seriously by the Peace Corps. So it was a real issue, and I had to negotiate with the Minister of Agriculture to resolve the situation. When I was a volunteer with the Peace Corps response in 2010, the safety of the volunteer was a lot more was taken a lot more seriously. I thought. I was wondering what you experienced because you're even more recent.
I thought our safety and security training was pretty extensive. We would focus, again, we had 5 days of training for 10 weeks. Sorry, that was 6 days of training because we also did training on Saturday. But nonetheless, we spent at least an hour to 2 hours every day focused on different safety and security scenarios. We knew the emergency action plan, but then also I was a safety and security warden. And so what that system was where these were leadership roles within the Peace Corps cohort for volunteers to act as a resource for peers who were more informed, who got resources from the the staff in country to be able to disseminate information rapidly and to have those lines of communication. So if something were to happen, we could act fast, such as being evacuated. So as a safety and security warden, I was one of the first people to be notified that we were leaving China. So then my role was to contact 15 volunteers who were my responsibility to make sure, one, they knew the information right away and that we were able to act. And so there are mechanisms in place that we were well aware of and trained for. So we knew who to contact and how to contact them.
Yeah, and just to add on to that as well, I think from a staff side of things, I think recently, especially with the expansion of technology in a lot of countries, just staff, especially safety and security managers, are just a little bit quicker to act based on things such as WhatsApp. And I know that, you do have to check in every relatively often, and they make themselves very accessible to volunteers as well. Similar to Jerome, there is also leadership on the volunteer side of things where there can be individuals who advocate for safety. I know that for us in Peace Corp Colombia, we had a volunteer advocacy committee as well as a peer support network. So whether or not you're feeling safe, uncomfortable, or just needed any support of any kind, there was a lot of different support systems to help volunteers. And I think that's something due to advocacy in the changing times. There's a lot more focus on volunteer safety, protection, and just general well-being than there was in the past when the Peace Corps was still in its infancy.
There have been a couple of instances of before the pandemic of some sexual assaults on female volunteers. Do you know how has that been handled? Because that was a real problem, back in the 60s anyway, and it didn't seem to be such a problem when I was in Bulgaria in 2010. But what is the Peace Corps doing now to protect, especially young women?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. And I know through some Peace Corps advocacy work that I do as a returned Peace Corps volunteer, there are a lot of advocacy groups for increased transparency within Peace Corps and also accountability measures as well. One of the greatest things that Peace Corps can really do at this time is obviously, as Jerome has mentioned, there's a lot of opportunity for change. So with that in mind, just more openness, more support for these volunteers who do come forward, but also just increased safety measures. I think one of the best things that organizations can do is to hold themselves accountable. And again, not just an increase in training, but increase in accountability and staff members and responsibilities in order to protect Peace Corps volunteers. I know that the NPCA last year in their report to the future outlined a list of items that should be changed in the future, not just from a sexual assault and prevention standpoint, but also a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint as well. I think with the times, Peace Corps is changing and needs to definitely focus a lot of its staff members and trainings into that area of improving and making sure that volunteers are safe in a variety of areas and also representing the needs of current volunteers.
Okay, you said NPCA, and I'm sure Beth understands what that is, but for the rest of us.
That's the National Peace Corps Association, the nonprofit that I mentioned earlier that works towards integration for returned Peace Corps volunteers and offering resources and so forth.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm just going to drop a link to that report in the chat as well.
Yeah, thank you, Kenny. So thank you so much. I might have even more questions, but I have to pause because it's already 7:38. So thank you, Kenny and Jerome, for your presentation and time. It has been a wonderful experience to listen to. Big applause to both of you. Thank you for sharing and being a true inspiration to upcoming generation. How to become more globally engaged, globally educated, and use your global experience to affect your life, the choices we make in our life, and build a better communities around us. So thank you so much, everyone. I thank you, Jerome. Thank you, Kenny. Hopefully we can keep in touch, stay in touch. And once again, if you have any ideas for any great speakers you can suggest to us, to World Affairs Council Tacoma, please do so. I will very much appreciate. So, as everybody else,
Lisa,
yes,
good.
yes, Frank.
Good prospects for members of the World Affairs Council.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, great selections that will be for for them to be the part of our board of directors. So we are looking for young people who have a very enthusiastic ideas and would like to be engaged in our community very actively. So thank you everyone for being here. I very much appreciate. So otherwise, let me put the gallery view. We still have people coming in. So if anyone wants to say hi, hello, you have like another minute and I will close the room after that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Miriam.
Okay.
Thank you. Great program.
Yeah, wonderful, you guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great time. Good evening,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.